Romans chapter 5, and we'll look at verse 13. For until the law, sin was in the world, but sin is not imputed when there is no law. Now, Romans 5:13 talks about until the law, and the idea there is this. The Old Testament law is not instituted until Exodus 24. What people often do is they think of the Bible where there's the Old Testament and there's the New Testament, and so the Old Testament begins in Genesis 1 and it runs through Malachi chapter 4, and the New Testament begins in Matthew 1 and it runs through Revelation 22. Well, the terms Old and New Testament are used, I'll say informally, to refer to the first 39 books and the second 27 books. But if you think carefully about what Scripture is telling you, Genesis is not really an Old Testament book. It's a pre-Old Testament book. So look with me at Hebrews 9. We're going to get Hebrews 9 and Exodus 24. So if you want to get both of those, get Hebrews chapter 9 and Exodus chapter 24. In Hebrews 9, we're going to go to Hebrews 9:18. And then in Exodus, we're going to go to Exodus 24, verse 7. So Hebrews 9:18 and Exodus 24, verse 7. So Hebrews 9:18. Whereupon neither the first testament was dedicated without blood. So it has neither and without, but it's really saying there's the first testament was dedicated with blood. Verse 19. For when Moses had spoken every precept to all the people according to the law, he took the blood of calves and of goats with water and scarlet wool and hyssop and sprinkled both the book and all the people, saying, This is the blood of the testament which God hath enjoined unto you. So in other words, Hebrews 9:18, 19, and 20, very clear. The First Testament, the Old Testament, was dedicated with blood, and what Moses did is he dedicated it using the sacrifice of animals. Verse 20 is the pronouncement, This is the blood of the testament which God hath enjoined unto you. So if you look at Hebrews 9, what that tells you is if you want to know where the Old Testament started, all you have to do is look in the Old Testament and see when did verses 19 and 20 happen? When did that take place? And wherever that took place, well, that's where the Old Testament began, because it talks about the First Testament being dedicated without blood. So get with me Exodus 24, verse 7. Exodus chapter 24, verse 7. And he took the blood of the covenant and read in the audience of the people, and they said, All that the Lord hath said will we do, and be obedient. Verse 8, and Moses took the blood and sprinkled it on the people, and said, Behold, the blood of the covenant which the Lord hath made with you concerning all these words. So what that tells you, Genesis 1 is a pre-Old Testament book. Job is a pre-Old Testament book. Exodus 1, the first part of Exodus, before Exodus 24 or before Exodus 19, depending on how you think about that, that's a pre-Old Testament content because the Old Testament is not dedicated until Exodus 24, verse 8. Now let's go back to Romans 5:13 just for a minute with the understanding we now have. Romans 5:13 says this, For until the law, sin was in the world. Well, when it says for until the law, we understand what it's saying now, right? It's saying prior to Exodus 24. So prior to Exodus 24, sin was in the world. So although the law was not instituted until Exodus 24, that's the point at which it was dedicated, man was obviously sinning prior to Exodus 24. What Romans 5:13 then says is this: sin is not imputed when there is no law. Man is a sinner and he sins constantly. But sin is not imputed, it's not charged when there is no law. So look with me at 1 John chapter 3 and verse 4. 1 John chapter 3 and verse 4. 1 John chapter 3 verse 4. Whoever committeth sin transgresseth also the law, for sin is the transgression of the law. So if someone were to say, what is sin? 1 John 3:4 gives you a definition of what sin is. Sin is the transgression of the law. In other words, it's the violation of the law. In other words, it's something you're commanded to do, and you fail to do that. You do the opposite of it. Now, compare that with Romans chapter 4, verse 15. Romans chapter 4, verse 15. Romans 4:15 says, because the law worketh wrath. Notice this part. For where no law is, there is no transgression. So if there is no law, how much transgression is there? And the answer scripturally is, there's none. Get with me Romans chapter 3, verse 20. Romans chapter 3 and verse 20. Therefore, by the deeds of the law, there shall no flesh be justified in his sight. Notice this. For by the law is the knowledge of sin. What does the law give you? According to that verse, the knowledge of sin. Now, one of the things people often think is they think, I'm keeping the 10 Commandments. Have you ever talked to someone, said, if you were to die tonight and God were to say, why should I let you into my heaven? People will sometimes say, well, I'm keeping the commandments. Well, if you actually know the commandments, now when they say that, one of the things I'm tempted to do is, okay, well, tell me what the commandments are. And if you can't tell me all of them, then I'm really skeptical that you're keeping them. Right? And there's more than 10, aren't there? What the law actually does is it gives you knowledge of sin. It gives you a list of things that you ought to perform if you're righteous. And if you read that list, you don't come away saying, God has to be overjoyed with me. Because here's his list of things to do, and I'm like 100%. I'm just hitting it out of the park. He must be so happy with me. No, when you read the law, what should you come away with? Well, not doing that. I'm really not doing that one. You don't come away justified. You come away guilty because what the law does is it gives you knowledge of sin. I'll say it a different way. When you actually read the Old Testament law, you realize there's a bunch of things I'm doing that I never even thought of as wrong. I never knew I was supposed to handle a bird's nest that way. I never knew I was supposed to make those choices regarding diverse threads in my clothing. How many of you get up in the morning, you put on a shirt, and you feel instant condemnation because you realize that the shirt is part cotton and part artificial substance, and you feel just incredible guilt as a result of that? You don't feel any guilt about that. Now you say, well, I don't feel any guilt about it because I'm under grace. You never even thought about it. You never thought when you go to the store, I should really check the labels and see what this is made of because I really don't want to violate what the Old Testament law says about diverse fabrics. See, what the law does when you read it, what it shows you is it illustrates my conscience, my being is so deadened to righteousness that I'm violating things all the time that it don't even bother me. And that's how the law gives you the knowledge of sin, because it points out your inadequacies, your failures constantly. Look with me at Romans 7, verse 7. Romans 7, verse 7. What shall we say then? Is the law sin? God forbid. The law can't be sin. God gave it. Nay, I had not known sin, notice what it says, but by the law. For I had not known lust, except the law had said, thou shalt not covet. The law gives the knowledge of sin. It is by the law that man knows sin. Now, if you go back with me to Romans 5:13, and let's put this together. For until the law, sin was in the world. So did people sin prior to Exodus 24? Yes. Even without the law, people sinned prior to Exodus 24. But it then says this, sin is not imputed when there is no law. When man has no knowledge of his guilt, does God impute sin to him? He doesn't. God doesn't impute sin until people know that there is a standard of righteousness that they are failing to perform. As long as they're ignorant of it, He does not impute sin. Look at verse 14 now, Romans 5:14. Now, if death came by sin, you might wonder, well, if sin's not imputed when there is no law, and death came by sin, then why did people die before Moses? That doesn't seem to make sense. Well, verse 14 is going to answer that question. Nevertheless, death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over them that had not sinned, after the similitude of Adam's transgression, who is the figure of him that was to come. So what's that verse telling us? So when it says, nevertheless, even though prior to Exodus 24, man did not have knowledge of the Old Testament law, sin was still imputed to man, even without the knowledge of the Old Testament law. Why is that? And the reason why is because man had revelation other than the Old Testament law that gave him the knowledge of right and wrong. And I'll demonstrate that to you in just a second. Now, Romans 5:14 says, death reigned from Adam to Moses. Men still died between Adam and Moses. And it then says, even over them that had not sinned after the similitude of Adam's transgression. Here's what that's talking about. So when Adam and Eve commit their first sin, what do? They eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? Once they did that, was it possible for anyone else to commit that same sin? Yes or no? No. Why not? Look at Genesis 3, verse 24. Genesis 3, verse 24. Genesis 3:24. So he drove out the man, and he placed at the east of the Garden of Eden cherubims and a flaming sword, which turned every way, notice, to keep the way of the tree of life. So what happens is man is expelled from the garden. So after Genesis 3, does anyone have the capability to commit the same sin that Adam did in eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? No, because he's been expelled. But men obviously committed other sins. So get with me, Genesis 4, verse 3. Genesis chapter 4, verse 3. And in the process of time it came to pass that Cain brought of the fruit of the ground an offering unto the Lord. And Abel, he also brought of the firstlings of his flock and of the fat thereof. And the Lord had respect unto Abel and to his offering. But unto Cain and to his offering he had not respect. And Cain was very wroth, and his countenance fell. So Abel brings a blood offering from his flock, and God respects it. Cain brings a salad, and God doesn't respect it. And not only does God not respect it, but then Cain is all upset. Look with me at verse 6. And the Lord said unto Cain, Why art thou wroth? In other words, why are you upset? And why is thou countenance fallen? Notice verse 7. If thou doest well, shalt thou not be accepted? And if thou doest not well, sin lieth at the door. And unto thee shall be his desire, and thou shalt rule over him. Here's what I want you to notice. In verse 7, when God says, If thou doest well, shalt thou not be accepted? What he's saying is, Cain, you knew better. You knew that a vegetable sacrifice was not going to be sufficient. And you chose to offer it anyway. So why are you upset? I mean, in other words, if you bring a sacrifice that you know is insufficient, why should you be surprised when it's insufficient? How would Cain and Abel have known that an animal sacrifice was required? What happens in Genesis 3? Adam and Eve start with a vegetable sacrifice, don't they? When they find themselves naked, they sacrifice a fig tree, right? And they make clothes out of the fig leaves. And they say, we're all good. Doesn't this look great? And what is God's reaction to that? No. Fig trees are not going to be adequate. And so when God creates coats of skins, where did he get those coats of skins? From an animal sacrifice, obviously. So what you're seeing in Genesis 4, here's the point. When Romans 5 talks about those that didn't sin after the similitude of what Adam did, when Adam and Eve are kicked out of the garden, there's no one that's going to commit the same sin of eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. They're not going to violate that particular commandment. But do they have some knowledge of right and wrong that God expects them to adhere to? And the answer is yes. He expects them to adhere to the knowledge of what a proper sacrifice is. And when they fail to do that, they sin. They're violating the knowledge that's been given to them, and they are held accountable for that. Look with me again at Romans 5:14. Nevertheless, death reigned from Adam to Moses, so men continue to die, even over them that had not sinned after the similitude of Adam's transgression. They didn't do the exact same sin. And then it says, who is the figure of him that was to come. The idea there is that Adam is a figure of Christ. Get 1 Corinthians 15, verse 45. 1 Corinthians 15, verse 45. And so it is written, the first man, Adam, was made a living soul. The last Adam was made a quickening spirit. And the last Adam is obviously a reference to Jesus Christ. Look at verse 47. The first man is of the earth, earthy. The second man is the Lord from heaven. Now this comparison between the first man, Adam, and then the last Adam, between Adam and Jesus Christ, we're going to see throughout the rest of the chapter in Romans 5.